Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we begin in Troezen, a small city by the sea, on the night a child was placed above a stone and a secret was begun. Find a comfortable position, let your body settle into whatever holds you. Breathe in slowly. Breathe out. There is nothing you need to decide tonight. There is no road you need to follow. Only this old story, moving beside you in the quiet. The hours are soft now. The world outside has grown still. You may let the weight of the day dissolve gradually, thought by thought, obligation by obligation, until all that remains is the sound of this old story and the slow rhythm of your own breathing. Tonight we tell the story of Theseus. Not only the hero of the Labyrinth, not only the king who forgot his sails, but the full figure. The child who chose the hard road, the young man who cleared the coast of its old violence, the king who carried both victory and loss in the same hands, and the old man who died on a foreign island far from the city he had made. His story is one of the most human in all the Greek mythology, because it is a story not only of great deeds, but of great mistakes. And because the man who made the mistakes was the same man who performed the deeds, and he never forgot either. Get cozy, settle in, and let us begin. Troezen was a quiet city, small enough that the sea could be heard from nearly everywhere in it, and the pines on the hills behind it made a sound in the wind that the people of Troezen had heard so long it had become invisible to them, like the sound of their own breathing. The city sat between the hills and the water in a way that made it feel held. The streets were not wide. The houses were built of pale local stone that caught the afternoon light and gave it back slowly, so that even after the sun had set there was still a faint luminosity to the walls that made the city seem to glow from within rather than from without. The citizens of Troezen were not great warriors. They were not famous builders or philosophers or traders. They were people who had lived in the same place for a very long time, and who had developed through that long habitation a particular quality of stillness and attention. They paid attention to things. They noticed the wind. They noticed the way the light changed. They noticed people. Pirithous was the king of Troezen, and Pirithous was old and very wise. The kind of wisdom that accumulates in a person who has watched things happen for long enough that the patterns become visible. He had a daughter named Aethra, and Aethra was young and quiet and attentive to things in the way that certain people are. Attentive not because they are looking for something specific, but because attention is simply how they move through the world. She had grown up in her father's house, watching him think. She had learned from watching him that the most important things were often the things that happened quietly, without announcement. Aegeus came to Troezen on his way home from Delphi. He was the king of Athens, a city far more powerful than Troezen, and he had been to the oracle to ask about children, about the continuation of his line, about the heir that had not yet come to him in his many years as king. The oracle at Delphi spoke in the way that oracles speak, not in answers but in images, not in clarity but in truth wrapped in metaphor, so that the person who received the words had to work for the meaning, and the working for it was part of what the oracle gave. The answer Aegeus received was about a wineskin, about loosening something before he reached the heights of Athens, about what would follow from that loosening. He did not understand it. He had spent the long road back from Delphi turning it over in his mind, and had arrived at Troezen no closer to its meaning than when he had left the temple. He came to Pirithous because Pirithous was the wisest interpreter of oracles in the region. He came with the specific humility of a powerful man who has encountered something that his power cannot help him with, and who has had the sense to seek someone who might know what he does not. This kind of humility is rarer than it should be. Aegeus had enough of it to make the detour to Troezen. Pirithous interpreted it. What Pirithous understood from the oracle was that Aegeus would father a great son that night. What Pirithous did with his understanding was to ensure that the son was fathered in Troezen, in the house of his daughter Aethra, so that the great son would have the blood of Troezen's royal line in him as well as the blood of Athens. Pirithous was not above a certain amount of arrangement in the service of what he understood the gods to intend. What Pirithous understood from the oracle, and what Pirithous did with his understanding, resulted in a child. The child would be Theseus, and he would be the greatest hero Athens would ever produce, and he would also be the cause of his father's death, and the maker of a city, and the man who forgot a sail, and many other things besides. But that night in Troezen there was only the stone and the secret. Before Aegeus left for Athens, he led Aethra to a great rock at the edge of the city. It was a flat rock, grey and wide, and it had been there as long as anyone could remember. The rock was not remarkable. Dozens of rocks of similar size lay in the hills above the city, but this one was near a path that people walked every day, and it had a particular flatness on its upper surface that made it look, if you did not know better, like a stone that had been placed there by intention rather than by the slow work of the earth. Aegeus took his sandals and his sword, the sword that marked him as king of Athens, and he placed them beneath the stone, and he rolled the stone back over them. He told Aethra what he was doing. He said, "When the child is born, when the child is grown, when the child is strong enough to lift this stone, bring him to me. Do not tell him who his father is until that day." Then Aegeus returned to Athens. Aethra kept the secret for many years, and the child grew. Theseus grew up knowing that something was withheld, not in a way that made him bitter. He was not a bitter child, not the kind of child who turns inward and makes a private grievance of what they have not been given. He was the other kind, the kind who grows outward, who encounters the world directly and learns from the encounter, who understands that what is withheld is sometimes withheld for reasons that will become clear. He grew up in Troezen, in the shadow of the hills, within earshot of the sea, under the instruction of his grandfather Pirithous. The old king taught him many things: the movements of the stars, the names of the plants that grew on the hillsides above the city, the histories of the cities of the Peloponnese and the dynasties that had shaped them, the art of speaking clearly and listening carefully. Pirithous was not a man who taught through commands. He taught through questions, through the particular Socratic method of a very old and patient teacher who understood that knowledge absorbed through genuine inquiry was more durable than knowledge delivered through lecture. Theseus absorbed it. He had the kind of mind that grows toward difficulty the way a plant grows toward light. Not because it is forced to, but because that is simply its nature. He was strong. That was apparent early. Not large, not in the way of some heroes who are described as though they could mistake themselves for buildings, but strong in proportion. Strong in the specific way of someone whose strength is a tool they know how to use rather than a quality they merely possess. He could lift objects that other boys of his age could not move. He could run long distances without stopping. He could hold a wrestling position through patience and leverage when strength alone would not have been sufficient. His body knew what it was doing, even when his mind was occupied elsewhere. He was his grandfather Pirithous' student in the arts of thought, and he was attentive to that instruction too. The wisdom of Troezen was not wasted on him. When the time came, Aethra took him to the stone. She told him what was beneath it. She told him what it meant. She told him the name of the man who had left it there and what his name meant, and what city that man ruled. She told him calmly, without drama, in the way of someone who has been holding a significant thing for a long time and has had years to decide how to give it over. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind many times. When it came, she did not find it as difficult as she had imagined. The boy who stood before her at the stone was the thing she had been keeping the secret for. He was ready. She could see that he was ready. Theseus looked at the stone for a moment. Then he lifted it. The sandals and the sword were there, exactly where Aegeus had placed them. They had been waiting for the right hands, and now the right hands held them. He put on the sandals, he took up the sword, he looked at the road. The sandals fit as though they had been made for him, which in a sense they had made for the feet of his father, and then held in trust for the feet of a son whose dimensions were not yet known when the sandals were hidden. The sword was heavier than he expected, the weight of a weapon made for a man rather than a boy, the weight of something intended not for practice, but for use. He held it for a moment, feeling the balance of it. The road to Athens divided at the edge of Troezen. One way went to the harbour, and ships left from the harbour for Athens, and the sea route was safe and quick and without complication. The other way went along the coast, overland, and the coastal road was long and difficult, and was known to everyone in Troezen for the men who travelled it and the things that happened to them on the way. Everyone in Troezen knew someone who had taken the coastal road and not been heard from again, or had been heard from only after the kind of delay that suggested difficulty. The road's reputation was not rumour, it was accumulated experience. Aethra asked him to take the ship. He took the road. He chose it the way he had chosen everything in his short life. Not from a desire for drama, not from a wish to prove something, but because the road was the thing that needed doing, and he was the person who could do it. He had heard the stories of what waited on the road between Troezen and Athens. He had grown up with those stories. He had listened to them the way a young man with his particular gifts listens to such stories, not as warnings, but as inventory. He knew what was there. He intended to go there. He understood this with a clarity that the young sometimes have before the world complicates their certainty. His mother watched him go. She stood at the edge of the city and watched him until the road bent, and he was gone. She had kept the secret for 17 years. The secret was done with now. What came next was up to him. The road from Troezen to Athens ran along the isthmus of Corinth, through the pine forests and the cliffs above the sea, through places where the rock narrowed the path and the drop to the water below was not small. The pines were old and grew close to the edge of the cliffs, their roots finding purchase in cracks in the stone that seemed too narrow to support them, their trunks angling toward the light that came from the sea rather than from the hillside. The sea below was a deep blue in the morning and a darker grey blue in the afternoon when the shadows of the headlands fell across it. It was not a safe road. The people who lived along it, or who waited along it, had made a habit of the travellers who came through. They had made a particular kind of livelihood out of travellers, a livelihood that the travellers themselves had not agreed to and were not pleased by. Theseus encountered them one at a time. The first was Pirithous, the club-bearer, who waited on the road near Epidaurus with a great iron club, and who used it on travellers in the straightforward way of someone who has found a method that works and has not seen the need to vary it. Pirithous was the son of Hephaestus, and he had inherited from his divine father a certain relationship to metal. The iron club was his pride and his tool and the thing around which his entire life had organized itself. He stood at the place where the road narrowed between two outcrops of rock, where a traveller had nowhere to go but forward, and he met them there. Theseus took the club from him. He killed Pirithous with the man's own weapon, and he kept the club, because it was a fine club, and because it is appropriate to keep something that has been the instrument of a great deal of harm, and redirect it. The club was iron, heavy, balanced for use as a weapon. It had killed many people. In Theseus's hands, it would defend the road it had previously terrorized. He carried it with him on the road. He would carry it for many years. The next was Sinis. Sinis was called the Pine-Bender, and the name was accurate. He had the strength to bend pine trees to the ground, and he made a sport of travellers by bending two pines down to the level of the road and tying one of the travellers' arms to one tree and one of the travellers' arms to the other, and then releasing both trees. This was not a sport that the traveller survived. Theseus bent the pine trees back the other way. He continued down the road, which was becoming, one encounter at a time, safer than it had been. He understood what he was doing. He was not only travelling to Athens, he was making the road to Athens a place where people could travel without being killed. The road had been a gauntlet for as long as anyone along it could remember. Each of the men who preyed on travellers had established their particular method, their particular location, their particular corner of the violence, and no one had been strong enough or determined enough to pass through all of them in sequence. Theseus passed through them in sequence. He was young. He was strong. He was thinking about what the road could be rather than what it had been. Not all the dangers of the road wore the shape of men. Near the village of Crommyon there was a wild sow, an enormous and savage creature that the people of the region called Fear, after the old woman who was said to have raised it. The sow had made the fields around Crommyon impossible to work. It rooted up the crops. It killed the herders who came too near. It had grown old and huge and fearless in its long reign over that stretch of country, and the people had learned simply to keep away from the ground it had claimed, which meant giving up good land to a single animal because no one could stand against it. Theseus did not go around it. He could have. The sow was off the direct line of the road, and a man in a hurry to reach Athens and claim a kingdom would have had every reason to leave it alone. But Theseus had decided what kind of journey this was. He had decided that the things which made the country dangerous were things he would deal with as he came to them, whether they stood directly in his path or a little to the side of it. So he turned aside, and he sought the sow out in its own ground, and he killed it, and he gave the fields of Crommyon back to the people who farmed them. It was a smaller deed than the others, and the traditions give it less attention, but the people of Crommyon would not have called it small. To them it was the day the land was returned. Sciron lived on a cliff above the sea. His method was simpler than Sinis's, and in its simplicity it had a particular contemptible quality. He sat on a rock above a great drop to the sea, and he told travellers that they must wash his feet as the price of passage. When they knelt to do so, he kicked them over the cliff into the water below, where a great turtle waited in the sea to eat whatever came down. The contemptible quality was not only the cruelty of it, it was the performance of hospitality and welcome around the act. He did not simply attack. He asked for service. He positioned himself as someone with a legitimate claim on the traveller's deference. He used the traveller's own courtesy against them. Theseus washed his feet. When Sciron's foot came up to kick, Theseus caught it and threw Sciron over the cliff instead. Whether the turtle ate him is a detail the traditions do not dwell on, but the road was safer after. Then there was Cercyon, the wrestler of Eleusis, who challenged every traveller to a wrestling match and who killed the ones he defeated, which was all of them. Cercyon was powerful and had been wrestling longer than most men had been alive. He had a technique that was effective against everything he had encountered. Theseus was the first person to encounter him who had also been taught by someone who understood wrestling as an art rather than a contest of force. Theseus defeated Cercyon using skill and technique rather than only strength, and the wrestling match at Eleusis was long after remembered as the origin of certain wrestling arts, as though even the encounter with a violent man on a dangerous road had produced something of lasting value. Then there was Procrustes. Procrustes had a bed. The bed was the object around which his practice organized itself. He told travellers that they were welcome in his house, and he offered them food and rest and the hospitality that the road requires. When the traveller lay down to sleep, Procrustes measured them against the bed. If they were too long for the bed, he cut them to fit. If they were too short for the bed, he stretched them until they were the right length. The bed, Theseus discovered, was adjustable. He adjusted Procrustes to fit it. By the time Theseus arrived at the outskirts of Athens, the road along the isthmus was a different road than it had been. The people who made a living from travelers on that road were no longer making a living. The road was not safe in the absolute sense, because no road is, but it was safe in the sense that the specific dangers that had characterized it were gone. He walked into Athens for the first time carrying the club of Pirithous and wearing the sandals and the sword of a king he had never met. He had travelled from Troezen to Athens, and he had cleared the road as he went. And this was not yet the famous deed of the Labyrinth, not yet the founding of the games, not yet the unification of Attica. It was the first act of a man who was becoming himself, one encounter at a time, on a road that had needed exactly this. Athens did not know what to make of him. He arrived without announcement, without herald, without the formalities that a prince arriving at a city might be expected to arrange. He arrived as a traveller arrives, on foot from the road, with the particular quality of someone who has been a long time getting somewhere and has not spent the journey softening himself. The city he walked into was a city with a problem it had not yet found a way to solve. Aegeus was king, but Aegeus was aging and had no acknowledged heir, and the absence of an heir was a source of tension that everyone in Athens was aware of and no one spoke of directly. The 50 sons of Pallas, a relative of Aegeus, were waiting for the kingship as though it were already theirs. The city had the specific restlessness of a place that is waiting for something to happen without knowing what the something will be. Aegeus was king of Athens, and Aegeus had a companion now, a woman named Medea, who had come to Athens from Corinth, and who had been given refuge there, and who sat beside the king with the specific alertness of someone who has survived difficult things by being more observant than the people around her. Medea had come to Athens after the disaster in Corinth, where her life with Jason had ended in a way that the world had not recovered from and that she was not able to speak about calmly. She had arrived in Athens alone, and she had found in Aegeus, who was not a young man, a form of refuge that suited them both. He offered her safety, she offered him counsel and companionship. The arrangement was not uncomplicated, but it was honest in its way. Medea saw Theseus the moment he walked into the hall. She did not see a stranger. She saw the sword of Aegeus and the sandals of Aegeus and the bearing of someone who is not a stranger to himself, which is a very particular bearing and is different from all the other bearings a person can carry. She understood what Theseus was before anyone else in the hall had formed an opinion. And Medea had been in Athens under the protection of Aegeus, and the arrival of the legitimate heir of Aegeus was not good news for her continued protection. She was a practical woman. She had lived through enough catastrophe to have learned the particular skill of acting quickly when the situation demanded it. She went to Aegeus before the young man could speak his name. She told the king that this traveller was a threat, a spy, an agent of enemies. She told the king that the right response to this arrival was poison, administered quietly at dinner before questions were asked. Aegeus, who trusted Medea and who had not yet recognized what he was looking at, agreed. The cup was prepared. Theseus sat at the table. The cup was placed before him. He reached for it, and at the moment of reaching, following some instinct of ceremony or habit, he drew the sword from his belt to cut the meat on his plate. Aegeus saw the sword. He knew the sword. He had placed that sword under a rock in Troezen and told a woman to keep the secret until the right moment. He recognized the sword before his hand reached the cup, and he knocked the cup away and stood and looked at the young man before him. Recognition passed between them without words. The cup rolled across the table. The wine spread across the stone in a dark stain. Neither of them watched it. They were looking at each other, and the look contained everything that had been withheld and everything that was now understood. Medea was gone before the cup finished falling. She had prepared for the possibility of being wrong, which is the kind of preparation that has kept her alive through many dangerous moments. She left Athens that same night and was not heard from again in this story. Aegeus told his son the truth of it. He told him the rock and the sandals and the oracle and the night in Troezen and the years of waiting for word that never came and the specific grief of a king who had no heir and who had hidden the seed of one in another city and was not certain the seed had taken. He told it all in the way that men tell things to their sons when the telling has been delayed too long. Not smoothly, not in order, but in pieces that rearranged themselves as they were spoken until the shape of the whole became clear. Theseus listened. He had the patience of someone who had waited for this all his life, which meant he had the patience of someone who had spent a long time not knowing that he was waiting. There was celebration in Athens. The prince had been found, or had found himself, which amounts to the same thing. The city observed the arrival of its future king with the specific pleasure of a city that had been worried about its future and had been given reason to stop worrying. The 50 sons of Pallas, Aegeus's nephews who had been positioning themselves for the succession, were unhappy about the development. Several of them organized resistance. Theseus defeated them in a series of engagements that demonstrated his military capability and his political intelligence simultaneously. He was not cruel about it. He was decisive. He made clear that the succession was settled without making unnecessary enemies of men he might later need. But the celebration was brief. The tribute to Crete was due. Every 9 years, Athens sent 14 young people to Crete, 7 young men and 7 young women, to be given to the Minotaur in the Labyrinth of Naxos. This was the price of a war that Athens had lost, or a debt that Athens owed, or a peace that Athens maintained through payment. The traditions give different reasons for the origin of the tribute. The Cretan account and the Athenian account differ. In one telling, the tribute began after the death of Aegeus, the son of Minos, who had died in Athens under circumstances that implied Athenian responsibility. In another, it was the simple result of military defeat. The details of the origin were less important to the Athenians who paid the tribute than the tribute itself, which was real and recurrent, and involved their children being sent across the Aegean to be consumed by a creature in a darkness no one returned from. Theseus said he would go. Aegeus said no. Theseus said that he would go, and that he would come back, and that when he came back the sails of the ship would be white. He said this with the certainty of someone who has just cleared the coastal road of its dangers and who has not yet learned the particular lesson about the difference between danger and fate. Danger can be overcome by strength and skill and intelligence. Fate operates in a different register entirely. Theseus had not yet learned to distinguish between them. Aegeus told him to change the sails to white when the ship returned, if the ship returned. The ship left with black sails. The voyage across the Aegean was long, and the sea was not always cooperative, and the 14 young people on the ship were not all confident that what Theseus had said would come to pass. He told them what he intended. He told them that the Minotaur could be defeated, that the Labyrinth could be navigated, that they would come home. He said these things with the same certainty he had said them to his father, and some of the 14 believed him, and some did not. And all of them arrived at Crete. The days on the ship were long days, the kind of days that happen when a voyage is significant enough that the people making it cannot entirely pretend it is ordinary. The sea moved under them. The sun crossed the sky. The islands of the Aegean appeared and disappeared on the horizon, some near enough that the sheep on their hillsides could be made out, others only dark shapes in the haze that might have been islands or might have been the memory of islands. The 14 young people talked among themselves and were sometimes quiet and sometimes not quiet, and slept when the night came with the particular sleep of people who are not sure what they are sailing toward. Theseus moved among them. He did not pretend that what they were doing was without risk. He told them honestly what he knew and what he did not know, which was not as much as he wished he knew, and he told them that they would face it together, and that he would do whatever a man could do to bring them home. Some of them found this reassuring. It was better than being told that everything would certainly be fine. Naxos was a palace of colour and height and organized complexity, walls painted with the shapes of dolphins and acrobats and bulls, and the deep blue of the sea from which everything in Crete had come. It was wealthy and old and not afraid of the people who came to it, because the people who came to it had not in living memory come for any purpose that was not ultimately to the benefit of Naxos. Ariadne saw Theseus. She was the daughter of Minos, the king of Crete, and she had grown up near the Labyrinth and near the knowledge of what was in it and what was done in it, and she had grown up with feelings about this that she had not been able to name until the moment she saw the young Athenian standing in the courtyard of Naxos, with the quality of someone who intends to do something that has not been done before. She had seen the Athenian tributes arrive before. This one was different. He was not afraid. He was not resigned. He was looking at the labyrinth the way a man looks at a problem he is already beginning to solve. She came to him quietly at a time when the watching was less than it usually was. She brought with her a thread, a long thread wound onto a spool, and she told him what it was for. She had learned the nature of the labyrinth from Daedalus, who had made it, and who understood it, and who had shared the understanding with her in a moment of confidence that Minos would not have approved. Daedalus had told her that the labyrinth had no secret, that it was not a puzzle with a hidden solution, that it was simply a space designed to produce disorientation in any mind that tried to map it. The walls looked the same. The turnings produced no landmarks. The deeper passages were darker than the shallower ones, and a person who followed the gradual darkening would tend naturally toward the outer walls rather than the center. The thread was the way back. A thread does not map. A thread does not require a mind to track and record and retain. A thread simply extends from where you began to where you are, without judgment, without error, without the possibility of forgetting. It is the most primitive possible solution to the most architecturally sophisticated possible problem. Theseus took the thread and wound one end around the post at the entrance of the labyrinth and descended. The labyrinth went down. It went down through corridors of dressed stone that turned without pattern, that doubled back on themselves and opened into unexpected spaces and narrowed again without warning. It was built to confuse, to disorient, to make the person inside it uncertain of every direction, including the direction they had come from. It was the architectural form of doubt. Theseus walked it with the thread in his hand. The thread was the simplest possible answer to the most complex possible problem. However many turns, however many false passages, however deep the structure went, the thread remembered. The thread kept the record of every step and every turn, and it was unambiguous, and it could not be confused by the architecture, no matter how the architecture tried. The stone walls pressed close in the narrow passages and opened into the relative freedom of the larger chambers and pressed close again. The darkness deepened gradually the further in he went. The sounds of the palace above became more distant, then inaudible, then replaced by a silence that had its own quality, the quality of a place that has held many sounds and absorbed them. The labyrinth had been built by Daedalus, who was perhaps the greatest craftsman in all the heroic age. A man whose relationship to making was as fundamental as other men's relationship to strength or speech. He had built many things before the labyrinth. He had built the wooden cow for Pasiphae, which had produced the creature in the labyrinth in the first place. He had built the wings for himself and for his son Icarus, and the wings had carried him to freedom and had carried Icarus to the sea. He had built things that worked better than their makers intended, and things that worked worse than their makers hoped. And in between he had built the labyrinth, which worked exactly as intended, which was perhaps his most troubling achievement. The labyrinth could not be navigated by intelligence alone. Daedalus had designed it specifically so that it could not. The only solutions to the labyrinth were the thread which Daedalus had shared with Ariadne in his one moment of conscience regarding the whole affair, or waiting in the dark until something found you. He found what was at the center. This is not the place for a long accounting of what happened in the labyrinth. That story lives in its own telling, in the full weight of its own strangeness, and tonight is not its night. What can be said here is that what Theseus met at the center was not a simple monster, not a creature of pure destruction. What he met was something that had been given a terrible life by the choices of others, that had been placed in the dark and kept there, and that was not entirely without feeling. The creature that Minos had hidden was part human by the nature of its origins, and the part of it that was human had lived a long time in the dark without company and without hope. The tributes sent from Athens had been its sustenance. This was a fact about which the mythology does not linger, because the lingering would make certain things harder to think about clearly. Theseus acted. He did what he had come to do. He followed the thread back. The 14 Athenians had waited in a room near the entrance of the labyrinth. When Theseus returned, carrying the thread, they saw his face first and knew from it that the thing was done before he spoke a word. They left Crete in the night, all 14 of them moving quickly to the ship while Naxos still slept. They had been given a particular kind of freedom that night, the freedom of people who have done something that should not have been possible and who are moving in the brief window before the world catches up with what has happened. The island of Naxos rose out of the sea on the return voyage, and the ship stopped there to take on water and to rest, because the journey had been long, and the people on the ship were tired in ways that went beyond the physical. Ariadne was on the ship. She had chosen to leave Crete with Theseus, which was a significant choice, to leave the palace where she was a princess, to leave the island where she was known, to go into a future with a person she had known for a very short time in extraordinary circumstances. It was not an unreasonable choice, given what she understood about her future in Naxos now that she had helped the Athenians escape and helped to end the life of the creature in the labyrinth. Her father would not have forgiven this. The palace she had known would not have been the palace she returned to if she had stayed. She had closed that door behind her when she handed Theseus the thread. She had known this when she handed it. She had chosen it anyway. It was an uncertain future. She was traveling toward a city she had never seen, with a man she had known for a few days, into a life whose shape she could not yet see. There are worse things. There are better things. She was not entirely unafraid. What happened on Naxos is told differently by different traditions. Some say Theseus left her there deliberately, for reasons that the traditions find difficult to explain or excuse. Some say he left in the night without intending to and could not return, caught by a wind that took the ship before he could go back to the shore. Some say a god intervened, that Dionysus, the god of wine and liberation and the specifically joyful kind of divine madness, came to Naxos and found Ariadne there and took her for his own, and that this was not a lesser fate than the one she had imagined for herself, but a different and in some ways larger one. The later tradition gives her a crown that becomes a constellation, the Corona Borealis, 7 stars in a curved line in the summer sky, placed there by Dionysus as a wedding gift. This is how the Greeks sometimes completed stories whose human resolution was unsatisfying. They gave the remaining figure a cosmic destination. Ariadne had been left on an island. The island had been Naxos. The god who found her there was the god of transformation. And the transformation in the end was permanent and beautiful and visible to anyone who looked up at the summer sky. Whether or not Theseus knew what he was doing, the ship left Naxos without her. He was thinking, perhaps, of Athens, of what he would say to his father, of what it meant to have done what he had done and to be returning. The harbour of Athens was somewhere ahead. His father was watching for him. He was bringing back 14 people who had gone to Crete expecting to die. He was bringing back the news that the tribute was over, that the Minotaur was gone, that Athens was free of its 9-year obligation. He forgot the sails. The ship had left Athens with black sails and had been supposed to return with white ones if the mission succeeded. Aegeus was watching. Aegeus had been watching the horizon since the ship left. Every day, every morning, the horizon and the sea, and the question of what the sails of the returning ship would be. He had stood on the height of the Acropolis, or on a cliff top near Saunion, and looked south across the Aegean and waited. The sails were black. Aegeus fell. The sea received his name, as the sea receives the names of all the great griefs that happen above it. The Aegean Sea carries his name still. The man who had waited for an heir and found one and lost him to the same black sails he had been watching for 17 years. The man who had placed a sword under a stone in Troezen and told a woman to raise his son until the son was ready and then send him. The man who had said, "Change the sails to white if you come back." The man who was watching when the ship came back and saw the black sails and did not wait to find out why. Theseus arrived in Athens to find a city in mourning. He had come to bring good news. He had come to announce the end of the tribute, the death of the Minotaur, the freedom of Athens from its 9-year debt to Crete. He had come to announce himself as the prince who had done what no prince before him had done. He arrived instead to find that his father was dead. He had killed his father, not with his hands, not with intent, but with forgetfulness at a moment when forgetfulness had the force of a blade. This is the kind of thing that lives with a person for the rest of their life. The understanding that a great victory and a great grief arrived on the same ship. That the sails that should have been changed were not changed. And that what was lost because of that cannot be recovered. He became king. He became king of Athens with grief inside the kingship, and grief inside kingship is not the worst way to begin. It produces a particular kind of ruler, one who knows that things go wrong, one who has already learned that even success has its cost, one who does not expect the path ahead to be without difficulty. A king who begins with triumph and certainty is a king who has not yet learned the lesson that governs all the others, that the world does not arrange itself to reward the deserving or punish the undeserving in the clean and timely way that would make governance simpler. Theseus began with this knowledge already inside him. pressed into him by the weight of the black sails and the news that met him at the harbour, and it made him, in his years of effective rule, a king who took fewer actions on the assumption that things would simply work out. He stood in front of the city that had just lost its king and announced himself as the heir, and announced the end of the Cretan tribute in the same moment, the grief and the victory together, because they had arrived together and there was no way to present them separately. The city received both. Athens understood something about the combination of victory and loss. It was a city that had experienced enough of both to know that they were not always cleanly separable. He worked. He unified the villages of Attica under a single government, which was a practical achievement that had eluded his predecessors for generations. The villages of Attica were numerous, and each had its own local traditions and local governing councils and local sense of independence. To persuade them to fold their individual governance into a single Athenian state required a combination of persuasion, political arrangement, and the occasional demonstration that the alternative was more costly. Theseus approached this systematically. He travelled to each village. He spoke with its elders. He explained what a unified Attica would be capable of that a dispersed Attica could not accomplish. He listened to their objections and addressed them seriously rather than dismissing them. The unification was not fast. It was not without conflict. But it was done. He established the Panathenaic Games, the Festival of Athens, the shared celebration that made the city something more than a collection of people living in proximity. He established the Isthmian Games, connecting Athens to the broader network of Greek civic and religious life. He built the physical and political structure of Athens, and he gave it, as much as any single person can give a city, the shape of itself. He ruled well for many years. The Athens that Theseus shaped was not the Athens of Pericles, not yet, not the city of the Parthenon and the philosophy schools and the naval empire. That Athens was generations away. But the shape Theseus gave to it, the insistence on unification, on shared governance, on the civic festivals that made the city a community rather than simply an aggregation of households, those things persisted and accumulated. Later generations of Athenians looked back to Theseus the way that people look back to founders, with gratitude mixed with mythology, with the tendency to credit him with more than any single man could have accomplished, and to forgive him the things that were harder to look at directly. He was not a gentle king in the way of a man who avoids conflict. He was a king who faced difficulty directly and resolved it. When the sons of Pallas moved against him, he met them in the field. When neighbouring peoples pressed on Attica, he pressed back. He was involved in many of the major events of the heroic age, sometimes at the centre and sometimes at the edge, always in the thick of things, in the way of someone for whom standing aside was not a natural position. He honoured the dead. He was one of the figures who insisted in the heroic world's politics on the right of the fallen to burial. When the 7 champions who had fought at Thebes were left unburied by the victorious Creon, Theseus went to Thebes with an army and demanded the right to bury them. He did not do this for political advantage. He did it because burial was a sacred obligation, and the refusal of it was an offense against the order of things. The Greeks remembered this. In the surviving plays, Theseus appears as the man who represents this principle, the king of Athens who upholds what is due to the dead when other kings are too afraid or too proud or too vindictive to do so. And then, because the story of Theseus is the story of a person who could not stop being a hero, he went to war. The Amazons were a people who lived in the lands beyond the eastern edge of the Greek world, in the territories where the Black Sea coast gave way to the vast spaces beyond it. They were warriors, and they were women, and they were governed by traditions that differed significantly from the traditions of the Greek cities. They had made a civilization of their own, organized around values that Athens did not share and could not entirely understand. The Greeks found the Amazons fascinating and threatening in roughly equal measure. They were fascinating because the order of things that the Greeks took to be natural, the arrangement of men and women in society, was reversed in the Amazon world. The Amazons were the warriors. The Amazons made the decisions. The Amazons governed themselves. They were threatening for exactly the same reasons. A society in which the assumed natural order did not apply was a society whose existence was, in a way, a standing argument against the assumed natural order. The Greeks addressed this discomfort in the way that discomfort is often addressed, by sending heroes to interact with the Amazons in ways that ended with the heroes leaving and the Amazon social structure being disrupted or destroyed. Theseus was not the first and would not be the last. Theseus went there. The reasons the traditions give differ and the distinctions matter less than the fact. He went, and he encountered a queen whose name is given variously as Hippolyta or Antiope, and he brought her back to Athens, either because he took her or because she chose to come, and the Amazons followed. The Amazon War was not a small thing. The army of the Amazons reached Athens, and the battle was fought in the city itself, in the streets and on the hill of the Areopagus, and the fighting was serious and real and lasted long enough that the Athenians who survived it told their children about it, and their children told their children. And the memory of it persisted in the city as the memory of a thing that had actually happened rather than only been told. Theseus's son Hippolytus was born of this union, a boy who grew up devoted to Artemis and to the hunt and to the forest, a boy who had no interest in the world of the palace and the court and the complicated politics of the Athenian royal household. His mother was gone. She died, in different versions, in different ways, in the battle, or later, or at Theseus's own hand by accident in the confusion of fighting. The traditions are not kind to her in their endings, which may mean that the traditions do not fully know what to do with a person who does not fit the categories they have prepared. Hippolytus grew up. He was serious and beautiful and uninterested in the things that interested his father, which is a way of saying he was genuinely himself, which is not always the easiest thing to be when you are the son of a king. He spent his days in the forest above Athens with a small group of companions who shared his dedication to Artemis. He was not ambitious. He was not political. He was a young man who had found the thing that gave his life its shape, and who was living inside that shape without apology and without the need for anyone's approval. This purity of purpose attracted the specific anger of Aphrodite, who regarded devotion to Artemis at the expense of devotion to herself as an insult. The gods of the Greek world were not above personal reactions to the decisions of mortals. Aphrodite arranged for what came next. Theseus married again. Her name was Phaedra, and she was the sister of Ariadne, which is a connection the traditions notice but do not pursue as fully as they might. It is worth pausing on it for a moment. Theseus had left Ariadne on Naxos, whatever the reason for that departure. Now he was bringing Ariadne's sister to Athens as his wife. Whether Phaedra knew the full account of her sister's story is not recorded. What is recorded is that she came from Crete to Athens as Theseus's wife, and she brought with her the specific quality of a person who has been given to someone they did not choose and who has decided to make something of the arrangement. Phaedra looked at Hippolytus. What happened in Phaedra's heart is one of the cruelest constructions in all the mythology. A love that was a curse, directed at the wrong person, with no good outcome available from any direction. Some traditions blame Aphrodite, who was acting against Hippolytus for his devotion to Artemis rather than to her. Some traditions simply describe what happened without assigning divine authorship to it, as though the feeling were sufficient cause for what followed and needed no divine explanation. Phaedra struggled with what she felt. She was not a woman who surrendered easily to what she did not want to feel. She recognized that the feeling was forbidden, was wrong, was a kind of madness. She tried to master it through will alone. She tried the remedy of distance, of keeping to her rooms when Hippolytus was likely to be in the palace, and finding reasons to be elsewhere when their paths might cross. She tried the remedy of occupation, filling her hours with the tasks of a queen, with the management of the household and the small decisions that accumulate in any large establishment. None of it was sufficient. The feeling was not of the kind that yields to management. It remained exactly what it was, a passion without an acceptable object, directed at a young man who had no interest in it and whose very virtue made it worse. She stopped eating. She stopped sleeping properly. She became ill in the way of someone who is fighting a private war that is consuming more than she can afford to spend on it. Her nurse, seeing her decline, pressed her for the truth. Phaedra told the truth. Hippolytus rejected her. He rejected her with the specific coldness of someone who finds the entire category of the feeling being directed at him morally objectionable. He was not kind about it. He was young and principled, and perhaps not fully aware of what the unkindness would cost. Kindness in that moment might have prevented what followed, or might not have. The forces at work were larger than the kindness of a single young man could have contained. Phaedra sent a message to Theseus before she died, and the message accused Hippolytus of what Phaedra herself had done. Theseus believed the message. He had 3 wishes granted to him by his divine father, Poseidon. This is one of the extraordinary provisions of his specific divine inheritance. a father who was a god of the sea and who had promised him 3 wishes in the way that gods sometimes make promises of this kind. He used one of them here, in his grief and fury, without verifying what the message told him. He called on Poseidon to punish his son. Poseidon sent a bull from the sea. Hippolytus was thrown from his chariot on the road near Troezen, on the same coast road that had been the beginning of his father's journey so many years before. He died from the injuries. The truth emerged afterward, as the truth tends to emerge when the useful timing of it had passed. Theseus carried this too. He carried it the way he carried the forgotten sails, the way he carried Ariadne on Naxos, the way every person who makes consequential decisions in a long life carries the ones that went wrong. Not lightly, not with easy forgiveness of himself, but carrying them was what remained possible, and so he carried them. He had made a mistake. His son was dead. The truth had come too late. These were the facts, and facts of this kind do not yield to grief or regret or the retrospective understanding that things might have been different if he had asked one more question before he acted. In the later years of Theseus's life, there was a friend. His name was Pirithous, king of the Labyrinth, and he arrived in Theseus's story as a thief. He came to steal cattle from Attica, and Theseus went out to stop him, and they met each other on the road and looked at each other, and the theft was forgotten entirely, because both of them immediately understood that what they were looking at was the one person in the world who was a genuine equal. The Lapithae were a people from Thessaly, from the high country in the north, and Pirithous had grown up with a different landscape behind him than the one that had shaped Theseus. He was confident and bold, and had the particular quality of someone who has never yet encountered the limit of what they could accomplish. He and Theseus recognized each other immediately as men who had lived at the edge of what was possible, and who had not been broken by what they found there. They were friends from that moment. Genuine friends, the kind that do not come often in any life, and that do not come at all to many people. There was a wedding feast at the court of Pirithous that became famous for the wrong reasons. He had invited centaurs to the wedding, which was an error of the specific kind that comes from trusting that the occasion will produce appropriate behavior from beings who are not always governed by occasion. The centaurs drank. The centaurs caused a disaster. Theseus and Pirithous fought side by side against the centaurs in a battle that was spoken of for generations afterward. They had stood together in a crisis and proved to each other what they already suspected, that they were each, in their different ways, exactly what the other needed in a companion. Pirithous had a plan. The plan was this: that the two of them would each marry a daughter of Zeus. Theseus had a specific candidate in mind, Helen, who was still a child in Sparta, whose divine beauty was already spoken of, and who would one day be at the center of the greatest war the Greek world had known. He took her to Athens and left her in the keeping of his mother. Pirithous had a less reasonable candidate in mind. He wanted Persephone. To want Persephone is to want what belongs to Hades, in the place that belongs to Hades. And no amount of heroic reputation changes what it means to descend into the realm of the dead in order to steal its queen. They descended. Hades received them. Hades offered them chairs, and they sat, and the chairs held them in the specific way that the throne had held Hera, with the comprehensive gentleness of something made precisely for that purpose. The chair of forgetting. They sat in it, and the years passed. Time in the underworld does not move the way time moves above it. The years passed without the sensation of years passing. They sat. Heracles came eventually. Heracles was descending on his own errand, the capture of Cerberus, and he found the two men in the chairs, and he pulled Theseus free. The earth shook when he tried to free Pirithous, which the traditions interpret as a sign that Pirithous was not going to be freed, that the depths had decided something about Pirithous that the surface could not override. Whether this was a judgment for the hubris of attempting to take Persephone, or simply the logic of the underworld asserting itself against the plan, the result was the same. Theseus came back. Pirithous did not. Theseus came back to Athens without his friend, having spent an unknown amount of time in the chair of forgetting, having been pulled free by a man who was on his own errand and who had made the time to help him on his way out. Athens did not welcome him. The city had changed while he was gone. His children had been taken, Helen had been retrieved by her brothers, the Dioscuri, who had also stripped Theseus of his Attic territories in the process. The political structure he had built had been disrupted. The city that had been his life's work had moved on without him, which cities do, which is the nature of cities. A city is not a monument, it is a living thing, and living things continue to live when the people who shaped them are absent. He tried to reassert himself and found that the ground he was standing on was not the ground he remembered. A city is not a labyrinth. You cannot follow a thread back to where you started, because the starting place has changed in the interval. The thread that had worked in the labyrinth was the thread that led back through unchanging stone. The city was not stone. The city was people, and people change in ways that stone does not. He left. He went to Skyros, an island in the northern Aegean, where a king named Lycomedes had properties that Theseus's family had once held. He went there with the intention, perhaps, of using Skyros as a base from which to rebuild something. He had been to the underworld and returned. He had built a city and seen it continue without him. He was not finished, he was simply trying to find where the next part of his life would begin. The island of Skyros was not a grand destination. It was a small island, rocky and windswept, with a harbour on its western shore and pine forests in the hills above the harbour and the cliffs on the eastern side that dropped directly into the sea. It was the kind of place where a person could think. The sea around it was never entirely still. The wind came in from the north in winter and from the south in summer, and the island had learned over many centuries to receive what the wind brought and to hold its shape against it. Lycomedes received him warmly. He took him to the highest point of the island, the cliff above the sea, to show him the view. The sea from that height was wide and still, the kind of view that makes a long life feel small and significant simultaneously. The horizon was very far away, further than it seems from lower ground, far enough that on a clear day the shapes of distant islands were visible as dark smudges against the brightness of the water. Theseus stood at the edge of the cliff and looked out at the sea that had his father's name in it, and from that cliff Theseus fell. Whether he was pushed or whether he slipped, the traditions do not say with certainty. The traditions say what they can say, that the man who had descended into the labyrinth and descended into the underworld and descended from the summit of everything he had built, this man fell from a cliff on Scyros, and the sea below received him. The sea received him without ceremony. The sea receives everything without ceremony. The sea had received Aegeus before him and would receive many others after. Athens, later, honored him. When the Athenians fought the Persians at Marathon, some of them said they saw Theseus in the battle, a great figure running ahead of the line with the specific energy of someone who has unfinished business. The image is a good one. Theseus was always ahead of the line. He always ran toward the thing that needed doing rather than waiting for it to come to him. After the Persian Wars, when Athens had survived and had some time to think about what it meant to be Athens, the Athenians retrieved his bones from Scyros and brought them home. They built him a sanctuary, the Theseum, in the heart of the city he had founded. They gave him the burial that a founding hero deserves. The sandals and the sword had completed a very long journey. Good evening and welcome back. For the last time tonight, we are near the end of the story of Theseus, and the road from Troezen is long behind us, and the stone is back in its place, and the sea outside Scyros is quiet. Let us name them once more before sleep comes. Theseus, son of Aegeus and son of Poseidon both, the traditions give him two fathers, mortal and divine, which suits a man whose life was divided between the human and the extraordinary. He lifted the stone and found the sword. He chose the hard road. He cleared the coast of Sinis and Sciron and Procrustes and Cercyon and Pirithous. He recognized himself in a king's hall by the sword at his hip. He descended into the labyrinth and found the thread. He sailed back with the wrong sails. He built a city. He went to war. He descended to the underworld. He fell from a cliff on Scyros. He carried what he had done, and he kept going. The thread is the symbol that lasts, Ariadne's thread, the simple line that ran through the most complicated architecture in the world and made it navigable. The city he built was a thread of that kind, a line running through history that connected people who would not otherwise have been connected, that made a space where something could grow. The thread does not require the maze to make sense. It only requires that someone had the wisdom to bring it and the steadiness to hold it. He was not perfect. The sails were not changed. Hippolytus died for Theseus's failure of verification. Ariadne was left on an island. These are the costs of a long life lived at full force, and they are real costs, and Theseus knew they were real. He carried them, and he kept going. The Greeks had a word for this kind of carrying. They called the weight of past action a burden that shaped the person who bore it, not always in the direction the person would have chosen, but in the direction the weight required. Theseus was shaped by what he carried. The forgotten sails had produced a king who paid close attention to the small things, who knew from experience how a small lapse of attention at the wrong moment could erase everything else. The death of Hippolytus had produced a man who understood the cost of acting on incomplete information, who knew that fury and grief together were the least reliable advisors a person could consult. The loss of Pirithous had produced a man who understood what it meant to come back without someone you had descended with, who knew the specific shape of that particular loss. None of this made him wise in the way that prevents mistakes. He was not that kind of wise. He was wise in the way that keeps a person going after the mistakes have happened. That allows the mistakes to become part of what a person understands rather than the weight that stops them. This is perhaps the most useful kind of wisdom for the actual conduct of a life, which involves many mistakes and requires the capacity to continue living it afterward. There is something in the figure of Theseus that is different from the pure strength of Heracles or the pure cunning of Odysseus. Theseus was both strong and clever, but what distinguished him was something else: the capacity to continue after his own mistakes. The sails, the message about Hippolytus, Ariadne on Naxos. These were not the mistakes of a foolish man. They were the mistakes of a man who was moving very fast through a very complicated world and who did not always have the time or the steadiness of mind to be as careful as the moment required. He knew this about himself. The carrying was the knowledge. Athens gave him, in the end, what it gives all its founders. It made him larger than himself. It took the particular man with his particular capacities and his particular failures, and it turned him into a principle. Theseus became the principle of Athenian heroism. The idea that strength and intelligence together could accomplish what neither could alone. The idea that the city was built on the willingness of one man to choose the harder road. The principle survived him. The city survived him. The thread survived him, became a symbol, became the thing that people reached for when they spoke about how to navigate what cannot be mapped. The thread is worth holding for a moment longer before sleep comes. It is such a simple thing, a line from here to there, maintained through motion and through attention, unambiguous in the way that only the simplest things can be unambiguous. In the labyrinth, the thread was literal. Outside the labyrinth, the thread was the thing Theseus held onto through every complication of his life, the intention to do what he had come to do, the intention to come back from it, the intention to carry what he had done and keep going. The labyrinth had stone walls. The labyrinth of a life has no walls, only choices. And the choices are not mapped either. And the thread that runs through them is the thread of whatever a person holds as most essential, carried forward through every turn. He had carried it a long way. From the stone at the edge of Troezen to the cliff at the top of Sciros. From the sandals placed by a king under a rock to the sea that received his bones. The thread ran through all of it. It did not prevent the mistakes. It did not undo the losses. But it gave the life its direction, and a direction sustained over a long journey is what makes the difference between wandering and going somewhere. Let your body become heavy now. Let the breath slow and the limbs settle into the surface beneath you. There is nothing more to carry tonight. The story has been told, and the hero has completed his road, and what remains is the quiet after a long journey. Think for a moment of a stone on a cliff above the sea. Think of the wide sky above it, and the water below, and the pine shadows on the path that leads back toward the city. Think of the road that stretches behind you, the long road, and all the things that happened on it, and how many of those things you carried farther than you thought you would be able to. In your mind, reach back and close an invisible door to the road, feeling it move on silent hinges, sealing the journey in calm and order. Then see a single candle, its flame steadying the darkness. With a slow, gentle breath, blow that candle out, and let the last curl of light fade into the night. Rest well, sleep deeply, and let the ancient stories carry you into the night.